For years, the UFC has promoted itself as the most tested, most regulated, and most professionally monitored organization in mixed martial arts. The message has been clear. This is the highest level of the sport, where performance is earned, not manufactured. And yet, when you look past the marketing and into the official records, a different picture begins to emerge. Not a picture built on rumors, not on social media accusations, and not on eye tests, but on something far more uncomfortable. Confirmed anti-doping violations tied to fighters who are still active, still ranked, and still competing inside the UFC today. This video is not about speculation. It is not about assuming guilt based on physiques, genetics, or dominance in the cage. Every case discussed here is grounded in documented test results, public sanctions, or official anti-doping disclosures. That word matters, confirmed, because in modern MMA, confirmation is rare, filtered, and often softened by time, narrative, or success. Over the years, fans have grown used to thinking of failed tests as relics of the past, something that belonged to the so-called wild era, before stricter oversight. But the reality is more complex. Testing agencies have changed, detection thresholds have shifted, enforcement standards have evolved, and fighters have adapted. Fewer headlines do not automatically mean fewer violations. Sometimes they mean quieter systems, narrower definitions, and more plausible explanations. This video breaks down what is actually known, who has officially tested positive, what substances were involved, and how those cases were handled. Along the way, a bigger question begins to form, one that goes beyond individual names. What does clean even mean in today's UFC? And if these are only the cases that made it onto paper, what does that say about the pressure, incentives, and gray zones that define elite MMA right now? To understand why confirmed steroid cases in the UFC feel rarer today, you first have to understand that the UFC's anti-doping system is not static. It has evolved repeatedly, and each shift has quietly changed what fans see, what gets announced, and what never becomes public. For years, the UFC outsourced its anti-doping authority to USADA, creating the impression of an independent, zero-tolerance system. Fighters were tested year-round, sanctions were published openly, and failed tests often came with detailed explanations. That era shaped how fans learned to associate positive tests with career damage and public shame. But that framework no longer exists in the same form. Today, the UFC operates under its own UFC anti-doping policy, with sample collection handled by Drug-Free Sport International and enforcement governed internally rather than by an outside watchdog. This distinction matters more than most fans realize. The rules are still based on WADA-aligned prohibited lists, but testing frequency, detection thresholds, and public disclosure standards are no longer identical to what they were even a few years ago. A lower number of public cases does not automatically mean a cleaner roster. It can also mean fewer positives reaching the level of public announcement, especially when trace amounts, metabolites, or timing issues are involved. Another key point often misunderstood is the difference between in-competition and out-of-competition testing. Certain substances are banned at all times, while others are only prohibited during competition windows. That creates technical outcomes where a fighter can test positive for a substance, yet see no fight result overturned, no suspension issued, or no official headline generated. To fans, that looks like nothing happened. On paper, something absolutely did. Then, there is the issue of thresholds and intent. Modern anti-doping policy increasingly distinguishes between intentional use, negligence, and trace contamination, especially with substances like SARMs, metabolic modulators, and hormone regulators. Fighters who test positive today are far more likely to argue procedural explanations rather than outright denial. Prescriptions, supplements, and accidental exposure now dominate official narratives, and in many cases, sanctions are reduced or quietly resolved. This creates a structural blind spot for the audience. Fans tend to equate no suspension with no issue, even though anti-doping records often show a more complicated outcome. And because only confirmed and sanctioned cases are publicly documented, everything else remains invisible. That's why the phrase confirmed violation carries so much weight in this video. It represents the narrow slice of cases that made it through every filter: detection, investigation, enforcement, and disclosure. These are not rumors or accusations. These are the fighters whose names appear in official anti-doping findings. Once you understand this system, a crucial realization follows. The UFC's current landscape doesn't eliminate performance-enhancing drugs. It redefines how they are detected, categorized, and explained. And that redefinition shapes which fighters are labeled as cheats, which are framed as victims of circumstance, and which never become public stories at all. With that context in place, the next step becomes unavoidable. Because once you look at the confirmed cases that did break through this system, patterns begin to appear. And those patterns become impossible to ignore when you examine fighters whose violations were not isolated mistakes, but repeated events tied directly to elite success and legacy protection. Once the mechanics of modern UFC anti-doping are clear, the most revealing cases are not the one-off positives, but the fighters whose records show multiple confirmed violations spread across different years, substances, and testing windows. These are not accidents that happened once and disappeared. They are patterns that survive changing rules, changing agencies, and changing public narratives. What makes these cases especially sensitive is that they almost always involve fighters who sit at the very top of the sport. Athletes whose value extends far beyond wins and losses into pay-per-view revenue, brand identity, and historical legacy. When a fighter reaches that level, a failed test no longer exists in isolation. It collides with business interests, fan loyalty, and the UFC's long-term storytelling. In these cases, the substances involved are rarely basic muscle-building drugs taken at random. Instead, they often include post-cycle therapy agents, hormone regulators, and long-term metabolites, compounds that exist on the edges of detection and are commonly associated with advanced doping protocols. These substances do not necessarily create dramatic overnight changes in appearance, which makes them easier to frame as technical or incidental findings rather than deliberate enhancement. This is where the concept of plausible deniability becomes critical. A fighter may test positive, yet the explanation offered focuses on trace amounts, timing, or biological anomalies rather than performance intent. For the audience, the result is confusion. A positive test occurs, but the fight result stands. A title is won, but later reclassified. A suspension is issued, then reduced. Over time, the narrative shifts away from the violation itself and toward the fighter's resilience, comeback, or greatness. What separates these elite cases from lower-profile fighters is not just fame, but outcomes. Lesser-known athletes who fail tests often lose contracts, opportunities, and momentum permanently. High-value fighters, by contrast, tend to remain central to promotion plans even after confirmed violations. Titles may be stripped temporarily, but the fighter returns to immediate contention. Records may be amended, but legacies remain actively defended by commentary, marketing, and fan culture. This doesn't require conspiracy. It's a structural reality of professional sports where enforcement exists inside a commercial ecosystem. When a fighter's presence is deeply intertwined with revenue, enforcement becomes cautious, procedural, and carefully framed. Another important detail is how repeat violations are interpreted over time. The first failed test is usually described as a mistake. The second becomes controversial. By the third or fourth, the language often changes entirely. Instead of focusing on substances, discussions pivot toward testing inconsistencies, scientific uncertainty, or administrative errors. The story stops being about enhancement and becomes about bureaucracy. This shift is powerful because it moves responsibility away from the athlete and into the system itself. Fans are encouraged to debate agencies, thresholds, and lab processes, rather than ask why the same fighter repeatedly appears in anti-doping records. The impact of this dynamic goes beyond individual careers. It shapes how fans understand fairness in MMA. When repeated violations coexist with championship success, it sends a subtle message. Past positives do not necessarily limit future opportunity. That message matters, especially to younger fighters watching from below. If the most successful athletes can absorb multiple sanctions and remain dominant figures, the deterrent effect of testing weakens. the risk begins to look manageable, even strategic. This is why repeat cases are so revealing. They are not just about substances. They expose how enforcement adapts when talent, money, and mythology collide. And once you recognize that pattern at the top of the sport, it becomes impossible to ignore how it echoes downward. Because if repeated violations don't derail elite careers, the next question becomes even more uncomfortable. What happens when confirmed positives appear among rising contenders who are still being actively pushed toward titles? If repeat violations at the very top of the sport expose how legacies are protected, the next layer reveals something even more unsettling. Fighters with confirmed anti-doping violations who are still active, still climbing, and still positioned as future contenders. These cases matter because they exist in real time, not in history. They influence current rankings, matchmaking decisions, and title pictures that fans are watching unfold right now. Unlike retired fighters or scandals buried in old eras, these athletes are part of the UFC's present and near future. What makes this category distinct is timing. Many of these confirmed positives occurred at career inflection points, before a UFC debut, during a winning streak, or just as a fighter was breaking into rankings. Substances involved often include anabolic agents, SARMs, or hormone-related compounds, all of which are known for improving recovery, strength, retention, or weight management, rather than creating sudden, dramatic physical transformations. That subtlety matters. It allows a fighter to serve a suspension, return looking broadly similar, and resume competition without triggering widespread suspicion from casual fans. From the outside, it appears as though the violation had little lasting consequence. This is where the disconnect between biological impact and disciplinary timelines becomes impossible to ignore. Anti-doping sanctions are finite. Suspensions last months or a year, but physiological adaptations gained during a performance-enhancing phase, particularly related to muscle nuclei, recovery efficiency, and training volume tolerance, can persist far longer. That reality complicates the idea that time served fully resets competitive fairness. Yet within the UFC's structure, once a suspension ends, the slate is effectively wiped clean. Fighters re-enter rankings, receive high-profile matchups, and are discussed as if the violation is a closed chapter. The UFC's approach here is consistent but revealing. The promotion rarely frames these fighters around their past sanctions. Instead, emphasis shifts to activity level, finishing ability, or fan appeal. Commentary and promotional material focus forward, not backward. This isn't unique to MMA, but the effect is amplified in a sport where margins are thin and physical durability matters deeply. For fans, this creates a cognitive split. On one hand, the UFC presents itself as highly regulated. On the other, confirmed violators continue advancing with minimal friction once eligibility is restored. Another factor that shapes perception is how these cases are categorized publicly. Fighters with confirmed positives are often grouped under labels like served their time or made a mistake early in their career, regardless of how close that mistake was to their current success. The language encourages closure, even when competitive implications remain unresolved. Over time, repeated exposure to this framing normalizes the idea that confirmed violations are simply another obstacle to overcome, not a defining factor in evaluating a fighter's trajectory. This normalization has consequences. It sends a signal throughout the roster that a confirmed positive does not necessarily cap ambition. A suspension might delay progress, but it rarely ends it. For rising fighters operating under immense pressure to stand out in crowded divisions, that message reshapes risk calculation. If the cost of getting caught is limited and the upside of accelerated development is significant, deterrence weakens. The system still punishes violations, but not always in a way that meaningfully alters long-term outcomes. What makes these cases particularly difficult for fans is that they resist simple moral framing. These fighters are not villains hiding in the shadows. They are competing openly, passing current tests, and earning wins legitimately under the rules as they exist today. Acknowledging that reality does not erase their confirmed past, but it does complicate how accountability works in practice. And that complication leads directly into the most controversial space of all, where intent becomes harder to prove and explanations become easier to accept. Because once confirmed violators can return and thrive, the line between enforcement and explanation starts to blur, and that blur defines the gray zone where prescriptions, supplements, and procedural errors take center stage. This is where the conversation becomes most uncomfortable, because the majority of modern UFC anti-doping cases no longer end with a simple admission or a flat denial. Instead, they live in a space defined by prescriptions, contaminated supplements, and procedural mistakes. Explanations that are technically plausible, often difficult to disprove, and increasingly common across the sport. Under the current UFC anti-doping policy, not every positive test is treated the same. Fighters can receive reduced sanctions or findings of no significant fault if they provide documentation showing medical use, accidental ingestion, or contamination. On paper, this reflects fairness and nuance. In practice, it creates a gray zone where accountability becomes harder to evaluate from the outside. Substances frequently associated with these cases include SARMs, metabolic modulators, and diuretics, compounds that can enter the body through supplements that are not third-party certified or through medications prescribed for legitimate conditions. The problem is not that these explanations are impossible. The problem is how often they appear and how similar they look across unrelated fighters. When multiple athletes cite tainted supplements containing the same prohibited compounds, or when fighters from the same gyms, regions, or management circles test positive for identical substances, coincidence starts to strain credibility without ever crossing into provable misconduct. That tension is what fuels skepticism, not outrage. Another layer of complexity is medical exemption versus procedural failure. In several documented cases, fighters were prescribed banned substances by doctors, but failed to obtain pre-approval from anti-doping authorities. Technically, the substance was medically justified. Procedurally, the athlete still violated policy. The result is often a reduced suspension that acknowledges error without labeling the fighter as intentionally cheating. To fans, this distinction can feel artificial. The substance was in the body, the advantage existed, yet the narrative shifts toward paperwork rather than performance. Over time, this framing subtly redefines what a violation means, moving it away from intent and toward compliance. This gray zone also benefits from scientific complexity. Trace amounts, metabolites, and detection thresholds allow cases to hinge on picogram levels, half-life arguments, and laboratory sensitivity, topics that most fans are neither equipped nor motivated to fully unpack. As a result, explanations that sound technical often go unchallenged, not because they are wrong, but because they are exhausting to interrogate. The burden of doubt shifts from the fighter to the audience. Unless fans can disprove the explanation, the default assumption becomes acceptance. What makes this environment particularly fragile is how it interacts with trust. Anti-doping systems rely not only on enforcement, but on public confidence that enforcement is meaningful. When too many cases end with reduced consequences and similar explanations, confidence erodes quietly, not through scandal, but through fatigue. Fans stop asking questions. Fighters stop fearing reputational damage. The system continues to function, but its deterrent effect weakens. It's important to be precise here. None of these cases justify declaring guilt beyond what has been officially confirmed. This video does not do that, but it also doesn't ignore patterns simply because they are inconvenient. Plausible deniability is still deniability, but when it becomes routine, it reshapes perception. The line between enforcement and explanation blurs, and the audience is left to wonder whether clarity has been replaced by manageability. That uncertainty sets the stage for the final layer of the discussion, because once you step back from individual cases and look at the full list of confirmed violations, reduced sanctions, and accepted explanations, a broader picture starts to form. And that picture isn't really about substances at all. It's about incentives, pressure, and what modern MMA quietly rewards. When all the confirmed anti-doping violations are viewed together, a pattern emerges that goes far beyond individual fighters or specific substances. The most revealing detail is not how many cases exist, but where they appear and how they are resolved. Violations are not concentrated in one era, one division, or one background. They show up across lightweight, middleweight, and heavyweight classes, among veterans and prospects alike, suggesting that performance-enhancing pressure is not a fringe problem, but a structural one. Modern MMA is faster, more demanding, and less forgiving than ever, and the bodies competing at the highest level are expected to absorb damage, recover quickly, and perform consistently under increasingly tight schedules. The incentives that shape these outcomes are rarely discussed openly. Fighters are paid to win, to stay active, and to remain healthy enough to accept short-notice opportunities. Rankings move quickly. Title shots can disappear overnight, and one injury can erase years of momentum. In that environment, substances that improve recovery, training tolerance, or weight management become especially tempting, even when the risks are understood. The anti-doping system punishes violations, but it does not change the underlying reality that the rewards for success often outweigh the consequences of getting caught. When suspensions are finite and careers can resume with little long-term stigma, deterrence becomes incomplete. Another revealing aspect is how history is rewritten over time. Confirmed violations that once dominated headlines slowly fade into footnotes, especially when fighters continue winning. Narratives shift from accountability to redemption, from sanction to legacy. Fans are encouraged to separate the athlete from the violation, to focus on current performance rather than documented past actions. That separation is not inherently wrong, but it does shape collective memory in a way that minimizes the long-term impact of confirmed infractions. Over time, this creates a culture where anti-doping cases are seen as temporary obstacles rather than defining moments. What ultimately stands out is the contrast between public certainty and private ambiguity. The UFC presents a clean, regulated image, and most fans accept it because there is no obvious reason not to. But the confirmed cases show that regulation does not eliminate risk, it manages it. Enforcement exists, but it operates within commercial constraints, scientific uncertainty, and evolving definitions of fault. The result is a system that appears strict while leaving enough room for gray outcomes. This doesn't mean MMA is uniquely corrupt or that every elite fighter is suspect. It means the sport operates under the same pressures that shape all high-level competition, where bodies are assets, time is money, and recovery is everything. The confirmed cases offer a rare glimpse into that reality, not as proof of widespread wrongdoing, but as evidence of how thin the line between compliance and violation has become. And that leads to the final question, one that lingers beyond individual names and substances. If these are only the cases that became public and confirmed, what does the unseen part of the system look like? By the end of this breakdown, one thing should be clear. Confirmed anti-doping violations in the UFC are not relics of a reckless past, nor are they isolated accidents that exist outside the sport's current reality. They are the cases that made it through every filter, the tests that triggered investigations, the findings that became public despite legal review, scientific complexity, and organizational pressure. In other words, they represent the visible surface of a much larger system. This video was never about declaring who is clean or who is not. It was about understanding what confirmation actually tells us, and just as importantly, what it does not. Modern MMA is defined by extreme incentives, short careers, and constant physical strain, and anti-doping policy operates within that environment, not outside of it. When enforcement evolves, thresholds shift, and explanations become more technical. Fewer cases reach public awareness, but that does not mean the underlying pressures disappear. It means they become harder to see. The UFC remains the highest level of the sport, and the majority of fighters compete within the rules as they are written. Acknowledging confirmed violations does not undermine that reality. It contextualizes it. It reminds fans that elite competition is never just about talent and discipline, but about systems, incentives, and the limits of oversight. As spectators, the responsibility isn't to accuse or excuse, but to stay informed and critical of narratives that are too clean, too simple, or too convenient. Because in a sport built on extremes, certainty is rare, and confirmation is only the part of the story that was allowed to be seen.